This is Karen on newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. And I'm really excited about today's guest. It's not the typical guest on Avoid the Maze. Usually we talk about our life's journey. And Greg, maybe this book really is your life's journey. Not quite sure. But any of you who remember Andy Griffith and Mayberry, it still exists on TV. I mean, it's how many he
It went on
recorded
the
it.
air. Yeah, it went on the
Yeah.
air back in October of 1960. And
Wow.
it's been on the air every single day since. So
Unbelievable. And we
Yeah.
got to watch Ron Howard grow up to be a man.
Yeah, absolutely.
On and off the show. So you wrote this book about Mayberry trivia. Is that correct?
Yep, it's the Andy Griffith Show Complete Trivia Guide. There it is right there.
How wonderful.
And yeah, it's actually, I wrote 2 editions of it. The first one I did pretty quickly because a friend of mine wanted to give something like that for his dad for Father's Day. So I wrote the first edition pretty quickly so we could have that available for him and other people that might wanted to give it to their dads for Father's Day. And then I put together a second edition, and then I put both into this, both versions into this one book. So it's got volumes 1 and 2 into it.
So if I'm not mistaken, Barney Fife, his partner in crime, so to speak, isn't he originally from that area as well?
Barney, Don Knotts, who played Barney, Jesse Don Knotts, who played Barney, as a matter of fact. And I say Jesse because Andy Griffith would always call on Jess, and it would really just tick Don off because he hated that. And that's exactly why Andy would call Don Knotts Jess. But he is from Morgantown, West Virginia. It's where he is from. But yeah, so not too far, right? Because we're in Manteo, North Carolina is where I live. Manteo, North Carolina is where Andy Griffith lived from basically 1956 to the day he died in 2012.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how does a man like Andy, born on the East Coast, not in New York City where actors are often found, not on the West Coast, how does he become an actor and have a TV show that just lasts forever?
Yeah, well, I guess the easy answer to that is that Andy went to school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for college. And when he was there, he joined a drama club, which was called the Carolina Playmakers. Now, the Carolina Playmakers were the drama students that most often filled the roles at the Lost Colony Outdoor Drama, which is America's longest running outdoor drama located here on the Outer Banks in the town of Manteo. So that's how Andy got to Manteo, and it's also how he got to his acting start. So he played in the outdoor drama. 1946 was the first year, and 1947 he played just a common soldier, and then skipped a year or 2 and came back as Sir Walter Raleigh for 3 years. So he really got his acting start in, like I say, America's longest outdoor drama, which is The Lost Colony. And from there, when he was down here in the summers doing that, he was kind of honing his stand-up act. There's it's a Catholic church now, but it used to be the Shrine Hall back in the early to mid 50s. And that's where he kind of honed his act of, what it was football and Romeo and Juliet. And, the different things that he had in his nightclub act that he took on the road then to places like New York City. And that's where he got discovered, is basically in New York City. He was in the Broadway play, No Time for Sergeants, and then ultimately the movie that came from that as well.
So it sounds like he liked wearing a uniform.
Yeah. A lot of what he did was wearing a uniform. Even when he did Matlock, and he was wearing that seersucker suit, I guess is what they call it. Yeah,
absolutely. So how did he and Don Knotts get together? I mean, they looked like they were a true match right from the beginning.
Yeah, the first time they met was in 1958 for the movie No Time for Sergeants. That's the first time they met. That's the first time they worked together. And as we said, the Andy Griffith Show went on the air initially in October of 1960, so a couple years later. The first episode, the pilot episode of the Andy Griffith Show, was actually part of the Danny Thomas show. Danny Thomas was driving through
Right.
Mayberry, got stopped. Andy was the sheriff. He was the justice of the peace. He was the newspaper editor. He was all of those things. And he was a country bumpkin, like the character he played in No Time for Sergeants. And so that's what the very first episode was. So Don was sitting at home. He actually saw that episode, called Andy up and said, you know, Ange, and he called him Ange, which was short for AG, Andy Griffith. He said, you know, Ange, I think you should have a deputy on the show. I think you need to have a deputy. So Andy thought about it. He went to the network, which was CBS, and the producers, Sheldon Leonard, and he goes, you know, Don Knotts came up with this idea. What do you think? And then ultimately what happened then was that they decided that Andy would be like this eye of the storm. So he'd be like the stable person and all the craziness would swirl around him. And I don't think if they didn't make that move, that show would have been as long lasting and as iconic as it had become. I think Andy playing a country bumpkin wouldn't have captured the hearts of America the way the show ultimately turned out. So yeah, they got together as part of No Time for Sergeants in 1958. There was no intention of Don Knotts being part of the series, but then, like I say, Don saw the pilot and called up Andy and made the suggestion.
I love that. And
Yeah.
I think you're right. Andy could have played a country bumpkin in a movie like he did, but a long time series, I think we probably would have started to see through it. Although in Matlock, sometimes that's how he came across.
He came across that way a little bit, yeah, but it was more of a, I'm going to let you think I'm not as smart as I really am kind of a way. That was really over the top on the Andy Griffith Show initially. And if you look at the movie No Time for Sergeants, the character that Andy played was somebody named Will Stockdale. And Will was actually the genesis of the Gomer Pyle character and was actually what Andy started off being in the pilot episode. So in the movie, as Will Stockdale, he's, walking around saying, golly, and Shazam and things like that, which is what he said in the pilot show. And ultimately what Gomer Pyle became. So yeah, I think it was a smart move to not play him off that way.
So there were a number of spinoffs from the Andy Griffith Show, right?
There were. Gomer Pyle USMC, obviously one of them. And then I guess you would say Mayberry RFD would be a spinoff as well. That came in 1968 when Andy decided to quit the show, or actually, I think the show. Well, no, he actually decided to quit the show, and he was on the very first episode of Mayberry RFD. That's when he and Helen Crump actually got married. And then they went to Cleveland, actually. Andy moved to Cleveland to be a postmaster in Cleveland as part of that very first episode of Mayberry RFD. Yeah.
And that's when Ken Berry took over the lead part.
That's correct. Yep, exactly. Yep.
See, I do know some trivia of the shows. As I was telling Greg, my husband, he watches MeTV whenever he can. And if Andy is on, that's what he watches. And he's always saying, oh, I've never seen that episode, until it's halfway through. And it's like, well, I've seen it, but I got to watch it again. There were some very unique characters on that show. The barber. I mean,
Floyd.
He looks like the small town barber in any town USA. The guy that played him, Howard McNair, I don't know that a lot of people know this or not, but Howard suffered a stroke a couple of years into the show. And the first couple of years, you'll actually see Floyd walking or, doing something physical. But then after he had that stroke, he never moved. They had to prop him up on a box that he held onto when he was standing, or oftentimes he was just sitting. He was immobile. So a couple of years into the show, Howard McNair was just immobile for part of that. Howard was certainly one of the
characters. Floyd the barber was certainly one of the characters. I think the one that I think that catches a lot of people's attention is Ronnie Howard, Opie.
Of course. Yes.
Because when Ronnie started that show back in 1960, he was only, I think he was 4 years old. He didn't even know how to read at that point. So his dad, Rance Howard, who appeared in a couple of different episodes, along with his little brother Clint, which you might remember played Leon, the kid that was always dressed in a cowboy outfit,
Yep.
eating peanut butter and jelly. Ronnie Opie didn't know how to read, so Rance Howard had to read the lines to Ronnie, and Ronnie then had to memorize it from his dad reading the lines to him. So
Wow.
talk about precocious at 4 years old. That is unbelievable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And look what he's
I
doing
mean, I just learned
today.
how to tie my shoes last week. So let alone at 4 years old.
Oh, well, I use slip-on, so don't have to
Oh, there
worry
you
about tying my shoes.
Well, actually, I use flip flops.
Well, yeah, you're near the beach, so of course you would.
Yeah.
So Aunt B,
Mhm.
she never aged. She was like one age eternally, it seems like.
Yeah, well, the show ran for 8 years, so you obviously noticed Opie aging in
Right.
those 8 years, but some of the other characters didn't really seem like they aged all that much, and Aunt B was certainly one of them. Aunt B, Frances Bavier, was actually a Broadway actress, and for a large part of the show, she thought the role was beneath her. And Andy has said in a few different interviews too that he had wished that he had treated her a little bit more with kid gloves than he did. It was not unknown that Aunt B, Frances Bavier, and Andy didn't get along all that well. She also did not get along with Goober Pyle, George Lindsay. As a matter of fact, George Lindsay off camera made a colorful remark, we'll say, and Aunt B took an umbrella and beat him over the head with it. So
Wow.
she wasn't the sweet old lady that you see as Aunt B on the show. She was pretty cantankerous and had to be dealt with kid gloves, is what they say.
How interesting is that? Because
Yeah,
you're right. Most of us thought of her as this sweet little old lady who, was just playing herself on TV.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Later in life, she moved to Siler City, North Carolina, and that's where she died, and that's where she's buried. And her headstone says Aunt B on it, and Frances Bavier, and yeah.
Well, she had to have been a little bit proud of her role.
Yeah, well, I would have. Yeah, she had to. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in later years she probably mellowed out a little bit. So
Absolutely. So, how many girlfriends did Andy really have?
wow, that's a good question. I never really counted them. There was let's see, there was Susan and Peggy and Ellie Walker and Helen Crump and Mary, the nurse. So what is that, like 5?
Yeah.
But Ellie Walker was played by Eleanor Donahue, who was
Yes.
from Make Room for Daddy. And she was on the show, and then all of a sudden she was off the show without any fanfare or anything of that nature. And I guess the official reason being was that Andy just didn't feel like a chemistry between the two of them. And quite honestly, Andy said he always felt a little awkward about women on screen anyway. So it wasn't anything that Ellie had done or not done. It's just that, Andy was kind of awkward around women when he was on screen. I mean, they had a pretty good chemistry with Helen Crump, Anita Corset, and that's the one that actually stuck around and for a while. But
Right.
yeah, most of the girlfriends were just, very short-lived, very in and out pretty quickly.
And Helen was a school teacher, right?
She was a Opie's school teacher, exactly.
Right.
And again, the one that Andy ultimately married on the very first episode of Mayberry RFD.
Well, you couldn't have kept him married if he got married on
Right.
his original show, because you needed a little bit of that conflict. And
Right.
then
Well, what's that meme that everybody is spreading around now? It's like, if you look at everybody in Mayberry, everybody was single, right? It was Andy,
Yeah.
it was Barney Fife, it was Aunt B, it was Gomer, it was Goober, it was Floyd, it was Emmett the Fix-It Man, it was Howard. Everybody was single. except for Otis. He was the only one married and he was the town drunk.
Right. Yeah.
So there you go.
Well, I don't think he saw his wife very often. He was more in
No,
jail than at home.
that's correct. Yeah.
So here we saw Ron Howard grow up.
Mhm.
Did they have any concept, or did Ron Howard have any concept as a young kid? Hey, this is where I'm going to be. This is my life.
I don't know. Maybe I don't know exactly that. I think maybe not so much on the Andy Griffith show because he was too young. But by the time he did American Graffiti, the movie, I think it was the George Lucas movie, I think at that point is when he kind of said, yeah, this is it. And maybe instead of acting, I'd rather get into directing. I think it was at that point is when he probably was mature enough, old enough. I don't know what the right word is,
Sure.
but said this is it. Yeah. And look what he became. I mean, just simply amazing. Yeah.
He absolutely is. And he appears not to have an ego. So I don't know if that's true, but that's how he comes across.
I never met him. And he was just here on the Outer Banks, in April, I think it was. He was down here and without any fanfare whatsoever, and visited a couple of places. And not everybody understood that it was Ronnie Howard that was here because he was wearing a hat and he was wearing a mask for COVID reasons. So,
yep.
It was hard to know if it was him or not. But after the fact, he had posted pictures of himself around town and so forth. And I guess what he had said was that, he had heard Andy talk so lovingly of this town, Manteo, North Carolina, that he wanted to come down and spend a few days to visit. And there's this place across the street from where Andy has his property, his house and 53 acres. It's called the Island Farm. And when Andy died, I think the Island Farm came into existence right after Andy died. And Ronnie donated $50,000 in Andy's name to get that Island Farm started. So, Andy certainly talked about this area. And Ronnie, I think, looked at Andy as a second father. In fact, I know he did. And I think I forget what I was saying now, but that's the problem with getting old. So
hey, we're all
look,
the
there's
same.
gray. There's gray.
Yeah. So I read somewhere that Don Knotts was really an introvert, and yet you watch him on just about anything that you've seen him in, and he plays this nerdy guy just about everything he does.
Yeah.
Is he really that introverted?
Yeah, I think, I'm sure that's probably true. I will tell you that most, I don't know if I can say most, but I could tell you that a lot of entertainers are introverted. Johnny Carson, for an example, was a complete introvert. And please don't think I'm putting myself onto these plateaus with guys like Don Knotts and Johnny Carson, but I do stand-up comedy and I do radio every day, twice a day. And I'm an introvert. There's a lot of I know a lot of stand-up comedians that before a show, they'll stand in a corner by themselves and not engage with anybody. But once they get up on the stage, it's a completely different person. So yeah, that does not surprise me that Don Knotts was an introvert. And Andy, I think, was somewhat that as well, because when he lived here in town, people always, I got to work with him a few times. And people always ask me, what was Andy like? Was he really like the Andy Taylor character, or was he something different? And, there was a couple of different Andys, I'll tell you that. If you treated him like anybody on the street, said, hey, Andy, as you're walking down the street past him, he'd say hi back and keep on walking. But if you threw a pen and paper in his face or try to put a camera in his face, not so nice. He didn't want to be that guy that was, a celebrity on the street. He just wanted to be Andy, who lived up the road just like anyone else. He used to drive this old beat up Ford Bronco down here all the time. You'd always see it. It's a red Ford beat up Ford Bronco. And it was nothing to have Andy standing in front of you or behind you in line at Hardee's, getting his egg biscuit and coffee. I mean, that's just the way it was. So in terms of the introvert extrovert question. I think, they're just regular people.
Absolutely.
And a lot of entertainers that I've come across anyway are strictly introverts, as
Well,
weird as that may be.
well, and I've noticed it since I've been doing my podcast, but even before
Mhm.
that, my brother happens to be a music producer, and
Mhm.
I'd go out to visit him in California. And if we were going out to eat, he'd say to me, "Now you're going to see people that you recognize.
Mhm.
You don't
Mhm.
have to say hello. You
Mhm.
don't have to run up and put your arms around them." And I said, "Well, I wasn't planning on it." He said, "But don't stare." And
Mhm.
I've repeated this story many times. My husband and I went out there, and we were sitting in a restaurant eating, and we're noticing all these celebrities around us.
Mhm.
And as we went to leave, my brother says to my husband, "So did you notice that beautiful woman sitting behind you?" And my husband was shaking. He said, "Yeah, I did." He said, "So you know who it is?" And he said, "Carol Alt." And my brother said, "Yes." And he said, "Did you notice all the idiots who went up to her trying to get her attention?" He said,
Uh-huh.
"Thank you for not doing that. But I wanted to make sure you weren't dead. You did notice who she was." And so I learned from that point on. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, we're all human. Okay.
right,
We're just
right,
taking a slightly different journey along the way.
right. And
So,
some may be more well known than others.
right. So I know Don Knotts had a daughter, Karen
Mhm.
Knotts,
Karen,
who
yep, yep.
basically is following in his comedic footsteps. Did Andy have any kids?
Andy did. And by the way, Karen, before I address Andy's kids, Karen does a one-woman show called Tied Up in Knots.
Yes.
And she tells a lot of stories of her dad and so forth. But yeah, Andy had two kids, both adopted, actually. Sam was his son, who unfortunately died fairly young. He had some drug and alcohol problems. And he's got a daughter named Dixie. Dixie lives in the Denver area. So those are his two kids, both adopted. He adopted them with his first wife, Barbara Edwards, who came down with Andy in the Carolina Playmakers to be in the Lost Colony, and was his first wife. She was actually in an episode of the Andy Griffin Show as well. She was in the choir. Kind of an interesting pact that Barbara and Andy had together. When they got married, they agreed that, and Barbara, by the way, was the more talented of the two. She was a better actress, she was a better singer, and they had this pact that said, whichever one of us became famous first, the other one will take the back seat and support them. Now, if Barbara would have became famous first, would have Andy actually been in the back seat supporting? We don't know the answer to
Right.
that. But yeah, so that was his family here on Roanoke Island. It was Sam and Dixie and Barbara. That was the family.
Interesting. Now, did he ever remarry?
He did. He married a second time. She was an actress. I don't remember her name. It was a foreign name from Spain, I think. And then he married again a third time. Cindy is his widow. He was married to her when he died in 2012. They got married down here on the Outer Banks in 1984, 85. And surprisingly, I was invited to the wedding, but couldn't go because I had to work. So there you go.
Couldn't get a sub to work for you. How do you
No,
like
no,
that?
no,
I
no,
like that.
no.
So all this information that we're sharing, I know there's some people out there that would
Mhm.
say, "Who cares?" And I care because it makes them more human. It
Mhm.
makes us realize that um, any one of us could have been Andy
Mhm.
or Aunt B. Is something that you
Mhm.
have to want to do to move forward.
Mhm.
And you
Mhm.
obviously chose to get in the entertainment field as well. Um, you said you were born here in Cleveland, Ohio, or lived
I
here in
was, yeah.
Cleveland. Um,
Born and raised St. Ignatius High School.
wow. Okay.
And this
Anybody
is what I'm
listening?
doing with my life. So-
When did you decide that radio and stand up was something you wanted to do?
Well, radio came at a very early age for me. My uncle, Rick Lemo's his name. He lives out in LA now and actually works for me at my radio station. Um, he was in radio, worked for the old WGCL, if you remember that, what WNCX
Yep.
was later. It was G98 WGCL. My uncle worked there. And I grew up on the east side, went to high school on the west side. So I would pass through downtown every day. And at the time, WGCL was on Chester Avenue, right across from the Greyhound bus station. So I would stop at the studio after school every day and sit in the studio with Tim Bird, the Birdman, who was on the air. So I would sit in with him while he was on the air, and then my uncle would give me a ride home, or I just made my own way home from there. But the radio bug kind of hit me pretty early on. And that was always what I planned on doing. So even when I was at Ignatius, then from there went to the Ohio State University.
Ohio State.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. And then got my first job up in the islands of Lake Erie as WOSC in Port Clinton. So radio was always the thing for me. And then stand-up came later. I did a lot of morning shows on the radio and did a lot of comedy with that. And I never really thought about stand-up as anything you could actually do. When I was a kid, my dad had the Button Down Mind of Bob Newhart record, which I just wore the grooves out on. And it never occurred to me that is something you can do. Well, I did a lot of comedy in my radio shows. And then one day I just came across a Dave Schwensen stand-up class that he still teaches over at the Cleveland Improv. And I took that and I basically haven't looked back. So yeah, it's radio and stand-up are just two of the things that I do right now. So.
Well, in stand-up is a real art.
Mhm.
And I don't think it's something that a lot of people necessarily plan for. Sometimes, like you said, you were adding humor to your radio show.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it was like, oh, I can sort of do this. Now I need to
Yeah.
craft it. I didn't realize how healing stand-up comedy really can be.
Mhm.
Mhm. And about 9-10 years ago, I just went through a deep depression. Nobody could figure it out. And my husband just got tired of seeing me feeling down.
Mhm.
He would drive me to the comedy club once a week.
Mhm.
And when I say drag, that's what they were
Mhm.
doing.
Yeah.
But as soon as the first comic got up on stage, whether I wanted to laugh or not, I was laughing.
Yeah.
And I finally found out after about 4 or 5 weeks that, hey, this is better than any medication I could ever take. Now that's for me.
What do they say? Laughter is what?
The best medicine.
There you go.
And, I'm so grateful that he did that. Now, every time we get in his car, we're listening to Cirrus and there's one comic after another. And sometimes I say to him, can we listen to something just a little more serious? But hey, what the heck?
More serious on Cirrus.
Right, exactly. So when you decided to write the first book and now the second book, the first book was basically for a gift for somebody. The second book now really was your choice because you felt you had more to say, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just a trivia book. It's really what it is. And so I because I felt both single books were not meaty enough. That's why I decided to put them into the one. And what's kind of cool in it is that well, right there, you see, there's some pictures in the book right there. I don't know if I'm holding it up right. There's
Yes.
like Andy's house that he grew up in and stuff, and pictures of the Andy Griffith Museum. So the guy that took those pictures, a mutual friend of ours, Michael Gersh, is actually came down with me, and we went to the Andy Griffith Museum and walked around the town that Andy grew up in and took those pictures. So yeah, I wanted to make it a little bit more meaty. And I was required by Gersh to say that he was part of the book. That was in my contract to him. So
I'm sure he said that.
Yeah, he did. And I had to do it in blood.
I get it.
Yeah, so it was something that people asked me about. They were like, should I get volume 1? Should I get volume 2? I said, you know what? Let me just put them together, and then you'll have both volumes in one book, and it'd be cheaper than buying volume 1 and volume 2 separately. So
hey, So how can people find the book? Where's the best place to purchase it?
Well, what I always tell people is I prefer them getting it locally down here on the Outer Banks. So if you're on the Outer Banks for vacation or whatever, let me just say you can find it at Downtown Books in Manteo, all locations of the Cotton Gin, all locations of Island Books. Collington Creek Inn has it. Bus 252 has it as well. But if you're not going to be here on the Outer Banks, I get it. You can also pick it up on Amazon. All you have to do is just search my name and it'll come up. Or actually search Michael Gersh's name too, and it'll come up. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, he's listed as a collaborator.
Well, he's a great collaborator, and I'm so glad that he had introduced me to you, because you do bring a breath of fresh air to this podcast.
Well, thank you.
And like I said in the beginning, my husband lives for his Me TV. He actually also went out and bought the full volume of CDs, and it's sealed. He refuses to open it up.
What's funny is I should have brought mine up here and showed I got the same thing.
Yeah. But I think we should all take a pilgrimage down there. I think that would be fun. It could take us back to our childhood or our teenage years or whatever era we were in when all this began.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Karen, one of the things that I also do is, again, the town that Andy lived in, and like I say, is buried on his property, is Manteo, North Carolina. That's where I live. And I also, Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays, 3 days a week, I do something called the Manteo Walking Tour, ManteoWalkingTour.com, by the way. And we walk along both through town and along the waterfront here in town. And we go through 400 years of history. This town was founded initially back in 1584 as part of the Lost Colony. We stop at several different places along the way. The Pioneer Theater, where Andy had a couple of premieres for a couple of movies, including No Time for Sergeants. We talk about Andy at the courthouse, because at the courthouse itself, there's a plaque to the right side of the front door of what used to be the courthouse that says Frank Cahoon, Sheriff of Dare County from 1946 to 1982. Well, as I mentioned, Andy came down here in 1946 initially. Andy Griffith show went on the air in 1960, so a full 14 years later. And in that time, Andy and Frank had become friends. And oh, by the way, Frank Cahoon's nickname was the Sheriff Without a Gun. So that's where the premise of the entire Andy Taylor character came from the Andy Griffith show. So we talk a lot about that on these walking tours. We discuss a lot about Andy Griffith. If anybody's down here and you want to do the walking tour, ManteoWalkingTour.com, you'll learn an awful lot about Andy Griffith, and you'll also learn an awful lot about Manteo and the rest of the Outer Banks as well.
Well, my husband's been asking me for ages, where would you like to go on vacation? And we are really not vacation people. I hate to say it, every time we've gone on a vacation, one of us has lost a job. So we have to think of it as either going there to do some work or visit family. So this would be great, because you're now part of my family since I adopted Michael as my son. And I could do a little bit of work there. So I'm going to tell him this is where we should go. Someplace that we hadn't thought about. But to all of our listeners, going back in history can really help us take the steps forward that we need to take today.
Let me show you my shirt. Can you see it? It says "Make America Mayberry Again."
Oh, I love that.
Make America Mayberry again. Yep, that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'd love to be able to sit on my front porch and, talk to my neighbors, and just doesn't seem to happen around here.
We do that down here in Manteo. We do.
Well,
and you can't go anywhere in town. I had like 3 people just this morning text me and asked if I wanted to do coffee with them this morning. So that's just the kind of town it is down here. It is Mayberry. It really is. Andy, in interviews throughout the years, has said Manteo, North Carolina. Well, he said Mayberry is a fictional town, kind of like Margaritaville is for Jimmy Buffett, I guess. But he said it is, if it's patterned after any one particular place in America, it is patterned after Manteo. And so that's it. I live in Mayberry. So
Well,
everybody should come down and visit.
absolutely. So Greg's house is open for all of us, everybody. I just won't give out the address. That's all.
I had to move since the last time Gersh was here, though, so he doesn't know where I live anymore.
Oh, poor Michael. We're picking on him a lot, but I think he can take it.
He can.
So again, I want to thank you, Greg. If you get up to
Thank you.
Cleveland, let me know, especially if you're on stage. That would be wonderful.
I will. I will be up there in the next 3 months, so I'll definitely let you know.
I love it.
And hopefully we'll be at the Funny Stop Comedy Club in Cuyahoga Falls when I'm there. So
very good. I look forward to it. And
right.
Thanks for all the trivia.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Have
and
a
I'll
great
be
day.
I'll be sending this book in the mail to you too, by the way.
I appreciate it. Thank
All
you.
right, no worries. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.